Hello everyone, just gone 3 o'clock here. Thank you all for joining for our anti-money laundering webinar here at Lawson Conner. We're going to get things kicked off here. A simple introduction to get things going. Our speakers today, I'll let them introduce themselves, but the first one is Gerhard Gruder, who's Managing Director at Lawson Conner. Second is Joe Woodbury, Director of our Investment Management Solutions, and Dorian Cameron, who is our Head of AML, KYC, and Financial Crime Prevention. So do you guys want to go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Yes, hello everyone, my name is Gerhard Gruder. Every time I'm chipping into that presentation, you just have to listen to a German accent that identifies me quite well usually. I'm one of the managing directors at the firm, and thanks very much for joining us on Anti-Money Laundering and Know Your Client webinar. We're going through a few challenges and also going to offer a number of solutions which make life easier in that space. To my left, one of my colleagues, Joe Woodbury.
Hello everyone, thank you very much Alex and Gerhard, delighted to be joining the webinar this afternoon. I'm one of the directors here at Lawson Conner on the Investment Management Solutions side of our business and have been doing a lot of work in the AML space, particularly in relation to some of the fundraisings that we've been assisting with as a firm. So we'll come on to look at that today.
And good afternoon, it's Dorian Cameron here. I don't have an accent, so you won't recognize me when I speak. Looking forward to participating, although I appreciate Joe Woodbury is going to have the most to say. So,
thank you, Dorian.
Thank you all. Just going to move on. Before I move on, I'm just going to also launch a quick poll for everyone to go ahead, and as we're going through this, it'd be helpful to get your feedback. And you guys we can address the results of this at the end of the webinar when we have a Q&A session. So you should see that poll now. It is in progress. And the question is, what aspect of AML is your primary concern? So feel free to give multiple responses there. We understand it's quite a complex industry and complex regulatory framework now. And we'll go ahead and review those results towards the end of the presentation. And then also, if you move your cursor to the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to submit any questions for a Q&A, which we'll also be addressing towards the end of the webinar. Already getting a lot of responses in from the poll, so thank you all for participating. And I'll just pass it over to you, Joe.
Yeah, just quickly, I think we have a limit of 100 participants on the call. I think we are close, we're 93 now. So maybe there's another 5 joining us, but we'll see that at the Q&A later today on the number of questions.
Yeah, that's an important point. We do want this to be very informative as possible, so please feel free to ask your questions during the session. There's an option for you to add questions, and we can take those at the end. I'm just going to jump ahead to our next slide, and we can end polling as well, so we can all see the screen as well. Just going to lay out for you what our agenda is for today, and I think really how we view the current AML environment is really a big challenge for firms looking to comply and keep up to date with AML and KYC regulations. The problem is that the landscape and regulations have changed dramatically over the last couple of years, and in many cases firms' processes have failed to keep up and to also adapt. We're seeing that obviously there's huge reputational risk associated with non-compliance or breaches in relation to money laundering or financial crime, and often the processes that people have in place are not sufficient. So there's no formalized AML policies and processes. Often firms run a decentralized process. Particularly we've seen this in relation to big law firms that we've worked with or private equity firms, where there is sometimes a use of administrative staff. This often leads to perhaps inefficient processes, fee earners having to become involved. That this generates potential conflicts as well. And we definitely have recognized a distinct lack of software. This process is therefore very manual, prone to error, lack of control, oversight, protection of customer data as well. So all of these things I think are very current given the environment that we're currently in. We can jump to our next slide. It's been a really busy year. Actually, apologies, just go back actually a second, just to highlight actually, I think before we jump ahead, the risks and the challenges which we'll come on to look at. So the risks are obviously fines. These are remaining high, the fines and possibilities of not meeting AML requirements are huge, and the solutions we'll come on to look at as well. These are software-enabled solutions and how firms can better comply. So it's been a busy year. We saw the 4th AML directive come into play in Europe. This had a greater focus on the ultimate beneficial owners and also around protection of data. We saw GDPR come into effect last week. We've also seen a much greater emphasis on smaller firms as well, having to comply with AML policies. It's no longer just about the big banks, the Deutsches of this world who got fined last year. It's also about the smaller firms now having to comply and have greater and more adequate policies and processes. What I think was really interesting, Gerhard and Dorian, from last year was actually that when the FCA fined Deutsche, they specifically highlighted that the reason they were fining them was because it was a failure to maintain an adequate AML control framework, which essentially means policies and procedures were not in place, and that a process and a framework was not adhered to, rather than an actual physical criminal activity, which is something that was quite interesting, I thought. We can also see that crypto and virtual currency platforms have become even more prevalent, and providers, custodian wallet providers as well, are also now subject to these new AML regulations. Okay.
I'm just wondering, Joe, when you tell me that there's these fines being handed out and everybody is struggling, why is it so difficult to comply with anti-money laundering regulations?
I think it's a volume issue, actually, Gerhard. As we previously discussed, I know during our previous conversations, it's really that there's often very manual processes and quite archaic frameworks that are decentralized that are in place, and people have not, maybe sometimes firms have grown quite substantially, whereas they haven't reviewed what their AML framework is and how they can actually, their firm and their MLRO function can grow in order to match that really, and match the risks that have increased as well in their firm.
What I'm seeing is, and I'm working a lot of very large anti-money laundering projects, and we're doing a lot of these projects on a one-time basis, but also on a fully outsourced basis. That what you see today in the industry is the use of basic email. It's the use of basic email to request data, to save attachments down, to go back to a client. And of course, if you're using email today, you're not complying because you don't have a clear audit trail, for example. What about if somebody leaves and was involved in anti-money laundering? How do you establish an adequate audit trail? Why certain decisions over anti-money laundering have been made in the past on that specific case? If that person no longer has access to email, nobody knows who was involved in any case. There is no case management as such. People don't know who can make which decision on waving through certain anti-money laundering cases. But what I'm seeing in a lot of these processes and procedures is that it's not standardized as well. There's no clear responsibilities as well, who can make which decisions. And a lot of these things, I think, make it extremely difficult for organizations to comply. The first time we come into these projects, the top questions we ask is how are you doing it today? And a lot is really based on the use of email. And there's many aspects. Dorian, you probably come across with as part of cybersecurity risks, as part of using email and cybersecurity. Of course, that's a huge risk in itself.
Absolutely, and I think the penalties for any contraventions since Friday when GDPR came in, I think that certainly focused the minds on a lot of businesses as to exactly how they use email and the risks that are attached to that.
For example, what I see when I work with law firms, when it comes to onboarding of new clients, very often it is a decentralized function where fee earners are involved in onboarding, together with their assistants and associates of that specific practice. So there's 2 or 3 people working on onboarding of one client. Nobody has any responsibility, and ultimately it all lands on the MLRO's desk of the law firm when any questions come. And it's just too many people involved, too much communication. It takes too much time in terms of processing. And what I've seen recently is that through the use of, and we're coming to solutions in a second, you can actually reduce processing time by 70 to 80% in addition to reducing risk.
Yeah, Gerhard, it's actually quite archaic, isn't it, that in this day and age, people are still requesting passports to be sent via email, and given
Yes.
GDPR, protection of data, and Secretary is sending out to new clients.
It looks like nobody is concerned about identity theft.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there's just keep on sending their passports.
And potential conflicts as well if a partner or a senior person is responsible for that new client being onboarded as well. Okay, so we touched on some interesting areas there. I think we can jump to our next slide, actually. What I wanted to highlight here actually is that we talked a little bit about how we see things from our perspective, from the clients that we support, but let's not also forget the other side as well. Cybersecurity is ever becoming more prevalent, and that means the people, the perpetrators, are also becoming more sophisticated. They're looking for holes. This is very active, it's not static. People are constantly looking for holes in an AML or KYC framework. This is a moving, dynamic issue. This could not just be associated with AML and money laundering. It could be someone slipping through the net because they've been able to find a breach in a know your client issue as well, and they've tried to find a loop and they've been able to get into the system. So the focus and the particular key issue here is around clean money as well. We've highlighted this because it's not just about processing from a money laundering perspective to generate money. The whole process is around making sure that that money is clean. And that is what the entire AML process and framework is about. And it's going to be something we come on to look at now in more detail.
Good.
Okay.
I think if you summarize what we discussed here, Joe and Dorian, is that there's a few important points to make, and this is just high level what we discussed before. On the one hand, regulatory obligations around anti-money laundering to a client are always changing, and that requires firms also to constantly adapt and introduce new procedures and processes. At the same time, the industry is not using any technology. They're using old processes, emails, which is not great to meet and comply with regulations. The third factor is that we discussed that the regulators are getting tougher because they're looking into these cases, and the enforcement teams from the regulators are looking more and more into anti-money laundering and financial crime. It's a big theme, not only in the US, it's in the Cayman, it's here in the UK, it's in Europe. It's a big theme is how regulators tackle anti-money laundering. And Joe, what you just said is at the same time, the other side of it, not the anti-money laundering, but the money laundering side is getting much more sophisticated in trying to get into the system. And if you put this all together and say, if you're using old systems and in a changing environment with higher penalties and also risks on a personal and firm perspective, I think we're heading for more problems in the anti-money laundering area if you don't introduce new methods, new systems, new processes, and new technologies which help us to tackle these factors we just talked about.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme, isn't it, Gerhard, and Dorian, that the use of software, we hear it overused so much these days, but it obviously cannot be ignored in this topic as well. The use of software, the use of technology is a way of doing more with less, essentially. So people are having to deal with a higher regulatory burden. The only way that they can deal with that whilst their businesses are growing in size is to utilize software and to come up with more efficient processes, which I think ties us in very well to this next slide, which is about our offering in this space, which allows our clients that utilize our Max Comply software to formulate a better AML process, which deals with everything we've been talking about, from data ownership, data security rules, audit trails, AML programs, oversight, policies and procedures. The point that we've been able to get to with our clients is to actually be able to send their investors or their clients their own login details to the portal so they can actually upload themselves. And they're not having to be sent emails to exchange personal sensitive information. They're not being chased by people from different parts of the firm. This means that on the client side, they're able to have much greater control over where the data is sitting, where potential bottlenecks are existing as well, and who is potentially holding up the process. So that whether there's been perhaps a discussion around a particular document, whether there's been a certified passport copy has been received, or if it's okay.
And help me, Joe, to understand, how would that work now if you use a software from a client perspective? You talked briefly about a portal or a link or something. What do you mean with that? How would that process actually work?
Well, if you think about it, really the point you want to get to is that the client has the easiest way to be onboarded. So what do we mean by that? Well, that client has to have a very pleasant and easy journey. It could literally be something as simple as receiving their own login details to the portal so that they can onboard themselves based on all of the processes and steps that the MLRO for a firm has laid out. So it's going to automatically be compliant in terms of what the MLRO of that firm requires from any new client coming on board.
Is it a little bit like if I order a book on Amazon? Is it that easy?
Well, yes, because you need to. Why shouldn't you be able to utilize software? Or if you can order something on Amazon on your mobile, then why shouldn't you be able to onboard yourself via software as well? I think that's a really interesting point, and it's something which this allows people to do a lot more with a lot less, and it's why we've been able to see people cut down this amount of resource or time that they spend in this area, and that their firms have been able to grow whilst these departments have remained the same. I'll give another example. I think audit trails, being able to generate an audit trail at the drop of a hat, if the FCA are coming in, because they could quite easily come in and ask you about your data retention policies, or they might ask you to pull up someone's a customer's information from maybe up to 6 years ago. You've really got to be able to demonstrate a full audit trail, why a certain decision was taken at a certain point in time, and who was responsible for that. So accountability as well. So this actually is highlighted in this next screen. What does the portal actually look like from both a client perspective, and also we can think about from an administrative perspective as well, if someone was actually using this software to onboard their clients. So seeing where bottlenecks are occurring, seeing who had ownership of particular tasks, where escalation measures have taken place as well. So if a certified passport copy has not been received, who is that escalated to? If someone's from a high-risk jurisdiction, how is that then dealt with? Who is that then escalated to?
You refer to case management and something like check rooms as well. How would that work?
Exactly. So if you think about it, in an organization, if there has been a discussion around whether a document is certified or not, whether something has met an AML policy or framework for a firm, it's really important to have that case management, that workflow management built in. So we have internal chat facilities and external chat facilities as well. So every time a client has uploaded something, they can provide a comment to that compliance officer or MLRO, and vice versa. If a person internally who's reviewing that wants to escalate that accordingly, either to someone on our side, a compliance officer, or to someone in their own firm, an MLRO, they can do that. And it means there's a full audit trail. And Dorian, that's quite important, isn't it, for the projects you've worked on?
It is. And the question I had for you was whether you've talked about the standards that are set out and decisions that need to be taken as to whether a particular document might meet those standards. Are you able to actually modify the standards that are laid out in the portal to the particular circumstances? So I'm aware from past engagements that certain organizations have higher thresholds above what might be required strictly by the letter of the law. Is that something that's accommodated within the offering?
Yes, absolutely. So we've actually seen that in the new directive that came out last year, thresholds of UBOs has changed, and that's an example. So some banks were already doing this, but other firms have said, yeah, we no longer need to be looking at only 25% ownership or beneficial ownership. We need to be looking as low as 10%. Or another example where it might be relevant to customize it is if you're trying to onboard a client from the UAE or Dubai, certain KYC documents that we're used to in Europe or the UK would just not be used. You would have to use something like a rental agreement. So certainly customizing the processes or the forms based on the client type, whether someone's a trust, are they a company, are they an individual, and having that all mapped out in the portal is absolutely something that it can do.
One question I had is that software you described, how can that be used? Is that very narrow to the applicability of investors, or can you use it across the industry? Or, you know, you talked about law firms and financial services firms, and you're talking about onboarding and know your client. What's the big benefit here? Yeah,
so we've seen several iterations of this. One very exciting one has been the use of fundraising. So ICOs or traditional fundraisings or private equity subscription processes. The logic is actually the same. You need to onboard the investor or the client, and you need to conduct a KYC process and an AML process. We've also seen it used in corporates internally. So we've mentioned legal firms, we've mentioned private equity firms that want to onboard, particularly legal firms actually, they want to onboard new clients. And this can be run either on an outsourced basis, so it is being running as a managed software. We are running that AML and KYC process on behalf of our clients, or the client can actually install the software on their side, and we can provide training, and their own team and their own resource can run that software as part of their own internal AML program.
Great.
So next slide. This is actually a case study. I mentioned a fundraising that we were involved with. This one was a particularly, very, very exciting global mandate, $900 million capital raising. And I think I speak for everyone that we couldn't have done this without the use of software. It just wouldn't have been possible given the deadline, the very tight deadline of only 2 weeks for this completion, and the global nature of it, the local knowledge that was required for certain AML requirements from both Cayman, US, Europe, and Asia as well.
If I just remember that right, we had 900 million capital raising. We had 2 weeks. We had, I think, 300, 400 entities, Dorian. We ultimately onboarded within 2 weeks.
Somewhere in that region, absolutely.
And we did that with, I think, two people roughly, one to two operators on the software side. And today that the project is finished, of course, but I think that highlights the potential benefit of using workflow management systems rather than email in order to reduce time, reduce risk, and processing time. And it doesn't mean that we're losing a lot of people in the anti-money laundering and know your client departments across firms. It just means that, for example, in legal firms, fee earners can earn fees and take care of clients rather than chase passports and utility bills.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So I think we've got time also for a couple of questions, whether we want to take those now from the floor. We've had a number of questions actually answered. I can see asked actually during the session, which has been fantastic. Have we got time for our first question? Alex, have you got which one would you like to take first?
Yeah, we've had a question come in. It's a very simple question, but I think one that's highly relevant. You guys can have a lot of input in. Is many providers simply settle on proofs of address for ID and KYC purposes. How important are PEP, which is political exposed person, and sanction checks? And can these be automated through systems?
I'll happily take that one. Yes, is the short on. Vitally important. I think there's increased focus across the board on politically exposed persons, and by the same token, emphasis on domestic, increased focus on domestic rather than merely internationally politically exposed people. Can it be integrated in the system? Absolutely. I think the reality is that the system makes it quite clear that there are additional requirements. If an individual is classified as a PEP, then there are additional requirements in terms of source of wealth, etc. And those requests or the need for that evidence is made clear in the process of them using the portal. So hopefully that answers the question that's been asked.
Dorian, and it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because there shouldn't be anything to shy away from dealing with PEPs necessarily, because quite often an individual, if they're a PEP and you tell them they're a PEP, it's often not a surprise. It's not the first time they've been asked that question, and they normally have information available, which they can make available for the purposes of onboarding. So I don't necessarily, it's not a showstopper.
I think we had a second question, which was very interesting, and that was, to what extent can the software be integrated and linked to other systems and data source providers as part of a comprehensive anti-money laundering solution, which is an end-to-end solution and not only an island solution?
Are you talking about other data verification sources?
For example, data verification sources, but also maybe internal systems.
Yes, absolutely. So the answer is yes. I've lost count. There are so many different services out there, but ultimately it's software, so it can be integrated. It's the same process, it's the same logic. It's just a question of identifying the ones on a client-by-client, project-by-project basis that we'd have to implement. I think the really exciting thing I've seen most recently is one of the law firms we worked with, Gerhard, which was where we were able to integrate it into their CRM system. That becomes very, very powerful, because you're able to see, okay, where is the client in the process of being onboarded, and then when the client has become a new client, that can all be activated, and that's all very, very clear within the system, and people can track that internally as well, so they're not having to log into a separate system. They can track it from their CRM type system that they use on a daily basis. We've had another question, I think.
Yes, one question was, how long does it actually take to process anti-money laundering checks with regards to SPVs, PEPs, trusts, sanction checks, newspaper searches, UBOs, and other of these checks? Why is it so much faster than if I did that manually?
I think if I can take that one, it's all to do with the fact that we are giving the various individuals that need to upload the data full access to the system. They've got their own login with a password. If it suits their lifestyle to be uploading documents at 2 o'clock in the morning when the rest of us might have retired for the night, that allows them to do that. So it really does just increase the security of the documentation, but also gives people the flexibility to upload those documents as soon as they can. The system then allows the operators at the other end to verify the documents and confirm that they're acceptable, or to go back and request further details. And once something is ticked off as being complete, it is then shown as a stage in the process as being complete. So it can be actively managed to achieve a completion of the required tasks as quickly as people wish to participate in.
Okay, so I think it'd be a good time to jump to our poll. I'll just go ahead and share those results again. And actually the poll question was, again, what aspect of AML is your primary concern? And the options listed were lack of experienced AML staff, lack of software technology solutions, increasing global AML legislation, cybersecurity risk, and no defined AML strategy. So be interested to hear from you guys, Dorian, Joe, and Gerhard. What are your thoughts on some of those issues and those primary concerns of our listeners?
Well, I think the really interesting parts from there, Alex, is actually the highlighting part there for me is the worry about software and about personnel knowledge of AML. So I think those two actually tie in quite well together, because if you think about it, if you have a framework which is somewhat a workflow management system and can take the framework that the MLRO wants to implement, some aspects of it is automated for instance, standard due diligence and routine checks that we've discussed as well, then that will alleviate the requirement for lots and lots of staff to know complex and detailed points around AML policies and global regulations. And obviously software is an enabler for all of that. So that's a way of dealing with more as companies grow as well.
If I look at the result of the poll, which is very interesting, I think, because the top two are together 52%. So 52% of the respondents said the problem is a lack of experienced staff and it's a lack of software and technology solution. But for me, also the lack of experienced anti-money laundering staff is part of a software and technology solution whereby technology can solve the training and development requirements of anti-money laundering staff. And because I just need half the staff or 70% less of the staff, that takes care of that problem of there is not enough anti-money laundering staff around. Because if I'm setting up precise procedures and processes on how anti-money laundering should be done with the use of a workflow management system, the level of sophistication I need on staff level, I can actually reduce. And I think that problem, so I can solve 52% of my anti-money laundering problems very easily with software. And then there's others where we said anti-money laundering strategy, but that's easy to implement. Yeah, we can easily implement a strategy. We need to agree on a strategy. We need to adapt it to the software. But a large part of that is really solved through workflow processes, I think.
Which in turn also generates value for the client as well, because the client's having an easier experience, an easier onboarding process. But I think that's really important to highlight that it avoids and circumvents the difficulty with hiring senior compliance staff these days, and even junior compliance staff these days. The banks have them, and the salaries have gone through the roof as these regulations have grown higher and higher. So it's the only way smaller firms can comply and keep up.
If I can just make one more comment, which is more of general nature. The last project I was on, and I was demonstrating the software and the solution to one of the financial institutions. The MLRO told me that, bringing their software to his money laundering department and function, he feels like, and it was a very senior person in the organization, it feels like bringing the fax machine to a company when a fax machine wasn't around. It is something revolutionary, because it really reduces and restructures and helps people to comply with today's regulations.
Okay, fantastic. I think we do have quite a few more questions, but we're just out of time. What we will do is we will follow up directly with any of you that still had outstanding questions. Apologies we weren't able to get through all of those on the session now, but thank you very much for the fantastic response, for all those that have signed in and for all those that have asked questions. We will circulate the presentation as well, and our contact details are on the presentation as well, as you saw earlier. Please do not hesitate to reach out to either myself, Dorian, Alex, or Gerhard with any questions that you have, and we'll be delighted to discuss further with you how we can work together. Thank you very much, everyone, for dialing in.